Welcome to the Domain Name Wire podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Alleman, and this is episode number 542. I write and talk a lot about UDRP cyber squatting cases. Sometimes lost in the noise is that UDRP, by and large, works. The majority of cases are won by complainants, and if only good cases are filed, they'd win all of the cases. It's rare that I talk to people on the complainant side of UDRPs, but on today's show, you'll hear just that. I interviewed Daniel Greenberg, the CEO of Lexsynergy, and Robert White, head of online brand protection for the company. One of the first things they told me was somewhat surprising but makes a lot of sense, and that is that UDRP is a last resort for most companies trying to protect themselves from phishing and other online abuses. There are many easier and faster ways, not to mention cheaper, to handle most domains used for these purposes. They also explained some of the nuances of domain disputes for country code domain names, including a provision for China's .cn domain that was rather surprising. And finally, we discussed the different dispute providers such as WIPO and the differences between them. First, a word from our sponsor. Our sponsor this week is Sav.com, which offers great prices on domain transfers. You can transfer your .com domains right now for only $9.65, .org for $10.52, and .io for $44.99. Plus, they don't raise your prices a lot at renewal time. In fact, right now, .com renewals are just $10.15. So go to sav.com/DNW/transfer to save money on your domains. That's sav.com/DNW/transfer. Let's go through some news from the past week before we chat with Daniel and Robert. First up, ICANN announced progress last week on improving universal acceptance at the organization. Universal acceptance refers to all domains working with all applications. So think about registering for a website, sending an email, and so on. This can be an issue on top-level domains that aren't among the originals, such as common.org, or top-level domains that are longer than 3 characters, and it's especially an issue with internationalized domain names. At the beginning of 2024, ICANN announced its staff could now send and receive emails that use IDNs. Now, people can register for ICANN's portal using IDN domains. That it took ICANN, which oversaw the expansion of domains including IDNs, so long to implement these changes shows how hard it is in the uphill battle to universal acceptance. To learn more about universal acceptance, listen to episode 471 of this podcast from January 29th of 2024. In other ICANN news, the organization decided to move this year's annual general meeting from Oman to Dublin. It is concerned about the conflict in the Middle East, which forced Qatar to shut down its airspace for a little while, crippling air travel in the region. ICANN stressed that Oman remains a safe place to host a conference, but it felt it should play it safe by moving to Dublin. The event takes place at the end of October. Well, the judge overseeing a lawsuit filed over expired domains at GoDaddy has allowed much of the lawsuit to proceed. 2 companies bought expired domains at GoDaddy auctions, butane.com and color.com. After they acquired these domains and made extensive plans and investments to use them, GoDaddy clawed them back, saying that they were auctioned in air. These domains were registered previously to a company called Color Gas at the registrar 123reg, a registrar GoDaddy owns. The judge dismissed the claims against 123reg due to lack of jurisdiction, and he dismissed some of the claims against GoDaddy LLC, but most of the claims will remain against GoDaddy Inc. This will be an interesting case to watch for sure. Well, Afternic posted its latest list of top keywords and domains sold on the platform. The top 4 remain unchanged from the previous month. They were AI, My, Group, and Bet. You can see the full list of top-selling keywords in domains in a post on Domain Name Wire from June 30th. All right, much more news at domainnamewire.com, but now let's chat with Daniel and Robert. My guests this week are Daniel Greenberg, the CEO of Lexsynergy, and Robert White, head of online brand protection for the company. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Daniel, you were actually on this show very early on. It was episode number 8 back in 2014. It was a really timeless episode because we were talking about one of the challenges of registering certain country code domains and how it's a challenge. And I know the market has changed over time, but there's still a lot of ccTLDs that have weird rules and weird registration paths. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I think a lot of them have progressed, and I think part of the progression is implementing dispute resolution services for them to give a lot more credibility to the domain, or to the TLD, should I say. There are some that have a few oddities, but they're all aligning towards the UDRP, but there has been significant progress on that side for some of those TLDs.
And today we're going to talk about UDRP and all these UDRP-like tools to get domain names that are used in cyber squatting, as well as the different arbitration providers and some unique things with different country codes. But first, Daniel, will you just give me the high-level overview of what Lexsynergy is?
Yes. So Lexsynergy, we're a corporate domain name registrar. So we're one of the most accredited registrars in the world. So we register domain names from .af in Afghanistan to .zw in Zimbabwe. And we mainly work with law firms as well as brand owners directly. And then we also have an online brand protection service, and that involves us monitoring for online infringements and mostly domain name related, recovering domain names through the various dispute resolution services, as well as removing a lot of online infringements. So whether it's social media or on a website, or fraudulent emails, anything that's online, we try to take offline if it does infringe someone's intellectual property. So that's the scope of the service there.
So one of the things that I talk to people, a lot of people, domain investors and such, we look at a lot of these things like brand protection and UDRP, and even the cases I write about are the cases where a company or a person goes too far, right? That reverse domain name hijacking, that sort of thing. But that's a very small percentage of the actions. And when these systems are working correctly, when UDRP is working correctly, it really should be like 100% are winners, right? 100% of the cases that are filed are won because they're legitimate cases. But I think it's important to understand that. And so I just say that right now for folks listening, that's kind of an important thing to think about is brands do need to protect themselves, and companies like Lexsynergy help them discover domains that are infringing and then figure out the best way to take those down. So will you all tell me kind of the process that you follow when, say, when something is flagged as, hey, this domain name is potentially infringing on one of our clients' brands?
Yes, so Robert obviously has his ear to the ground when it comes to UDRPs. I'll just give you my view on it, and then we can talk about the practical aspects of that. Is generally it's our view that a UDRP is seen as the last resort. And that's unless you really need the domain, you need it for a certain, say, purpose, or it's a direct match of your trademark. So, for instance, if someone had to register Lexsynergy.net, for example, and we've got the trademark Lexsynergy, then obviously it makes sense for us to own it, and that's the way we'd recover it if the owner is not cooperating. However, in some cases, people or certain brand owners have fallen in love with the UDRP, and they feel that that's the only way to get the issue resolved. And I think, Robert, you've dealt with a lot of those where you come up with other ways to resolve it rather than going through the UDRP itself.
That's correct, yes, because I'm certainly observing recent cases. I would say a huge majority of those domains are certainly conflicting from an infringement point of view, but they may be a plural domain or they might be a typographical misspelling. So the domain name itself, the brand owner may not necessarily choose to register that domain in ordinary circumstances. They just don't want it deep down, don't want it to be used to point to a fraudulent website or infringing website. So what we do is we would try and use our other enforcement service to try and have the services related to that domain suspended so it can't be used for email, so it can't be used for fraud. And then we've got a clever piece of technology that called our automated back order system, which attempts to snap up those domains in the event the domain of concern is deleted. So very often we can recover domain names for brand owners. We can take it down, first of all, to remove the immediate harm, the immediate damage caused. And then potentially we can recover that via a back order system without necessarily resorting to the UDRP, and thereby saving brand owners money for that.
And just jumping onto that is, say if there is an active site and they want to recover the domain, say it's a phishing site or something like that, the issue with the UDRP is that the domain name gets locked by the registrar. So that means for the duration of the UDRP, it can be 60 to 80 days, depending on how long it works with the timings, is you're stuck in that position where the site will remain as is, unless obviously the host provider takes it down. But if it's a name server issue, it's kind of frozen in time in a way, which can cause some issues.
Right. So you're talking about like using mechanisms with the registry and potentially registrar to suspend the domain name?
Correct, yes.
Okay. And do you find, I know there have been a lot of initiatives where, with ICANN and otherwise for creating kind of streamlined systems for this and that. Do you find that the process has been getting better? And are there certain registries and registrars that are easier to work with? You don't have to name names, but just give some like a threshold on or scale on what it's like.
I would love to name and shame, but I won't do that. We'll keep that for the next podcast that I'm invited on. But essentially, and I think Robert can also attest to this and can expand on it, but it is becoming, I would say, a bigger problem. I think we have a lot of laws out there, GDPR and various others, that are making it a lot more difficult for brand owners to enforce their rights to take down things where in the past it would be relatively straightforward. Just by the mere nature of volume and the laws, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And I think, Robert, you've seen that yourself, that some of these automated services don't work anymore.
No, they don't. They don't work for a variety of reasons, because the key to our success is that they're not able to particularize the details of that particular infringement. Each case is different. Each potential outcome you might want or you're asking for is slightly different. And due to the sheer volume of abuse reports that a particular hosting provider, registrar, registry will deal with, they will spend a few seconds just looking at it. They can't readily identify what the issue is, then I'm afraid it won't get looked at.
And unfortunately, you're sitting there and it can be blatant in some cases, but then you'd have to wait the time. They either need X number of hours to revert to their client or they have to go through their internal processes. And I do think it has slowed down a lot. And I think a lot of people are frustrated where things should be taken down relatively quickly aren't. And I think the same holds true to other forums as well, where I think it's placed a huge burden on support staff that have to go through these complaints.
Right.
Or these takedown requests.
Right. To be fair, they need to be somewhat careful. I mean, I've had domain name wire go down because of a false complaint and that sort of thing. And so to some extent, I think that has to do with maybe if they trust who submits the complaint or not, but there is a duty of care that they have to take.
Yes, I agree with that. I think there should be mechanisms in a way to kind of whitelist certain providers that are in this industry of removing blatant infringements and or phishing. For example, if there's a login, bank login, that should be dealt with relatively quickly because you can see that. Where it's someone alleging, copyright, someone has copied a paragraph or what I've written, then obviously you would scrutinize it. I think they can categorize it and they can look at it and maybe work with the people that are reporting it. In some cases, they have a checklist, and if you don't check all the boxes, it gets thrown out. And in some cases, it could be a serious issue in that we had one case where they were selling sweets with cannabis in it, targeting children. Now, you don't know how many children or parents ordered these sweets online. Every second counts. And I think it's very important that they come up with the mechanisms because the laws have, in fact, slowed it down. So what can business do to speed it up now in light of that?
And then I guess, do you guys work at all with any of the trusted notifier programs? So I think they're fairly limited at this point, but I know Identity Digital works with the Motion Picture Association, that sort of thing. Is that coming to play at all with your clients?
Not so much. We haven't had too much of that. In certain cases, if we had to utilize something like that, we would. But in most cases, it's very ad hoc because it also depends on the jurisdiction of where it is. We have a lot of issues sometimes in Russia. So someone could be using Ukrainian name servers with a Russian registrar that's hosted in India. And then things get really complicated. It really depends where it is.
Okay. I'm very familiar with UDRP. I think most of my listeners are. But when I think about beyond, say, the domains that work with UDRP, what are some of the other alternative dispute resolution procedures in other countries? And what are some of their specific requirements? How does it differ?
There are a lot of countries that have their CCTLD operators, as you say, that have their own dispute resolution services. Some just adopt the UDRP as is. There are a handful of countries that do that. And then there are others that have variations of that. So they've either based it on the UDRP or they've based it on the Nominet Dispute Resolution Service, the DRS. But there are some oddities to some of them. So China, for example, which is the CNDRP, has a provision in it that it only applies in the first 3 years of the registration. So if it's registered in year 1, you've got until year 3 to use that dispute resolution. And then it's very similar to the 3 elements of the UDRP, except it's registered or used in bad faith, or.
Which that is very common, right? The or versus in bad faith.
Exactly. So they're trying to make it a little bit more, increase the scope of it. But the problem is that squatter lays low for the first 3 years. So he waits for the first 3 years to lapse. And then Robert and his team have seen this very often. They pop their heads up after the 3rd year. They put a site up saying, I'm selling this domain because of X, Y, and Z. And then they know that the trademark owner would have to go through a local court to recover that because now the CNDRP no longer applies after that window period. Now, the cost of that is significantly high, as well as there are a lot of delays and it's quite time consuming. And
going to the local courts in China.
Local courts, local lawyers, language, and all those other things. And so then they know they can get a lot more for the domain because the client is maybe more desperate to get it.
Interesting. And so in just the way that works, if you were to flag it, if you were to notice that this person registered a domain similar to a trademark you have, if they aren't doing anything with the domain yet, when you were file a case under the .cn dispute resolution, would that make it harder to get it because they haven't used it yet?
So, Robert, I think we've recovered quite a few domains where they haven't used it, as far as I'm aware.
Yes,
So-
well, where there's been no evidence of active use, we have actually still recovered domains, and that's where the essentially applies to well-known brands where they have a reputation. So, for example, if it was Nike outlet.cn, for example, we've all heard of Nike and that domain wasn't used. That domain, the domain owner could have only registered and used that domain name with the Nike brand owner in mind, even if they hadn't used it. And that can be a grounds to file domain name complaints under the local procedures.
Okay. Well, what are some other CCTLDs with unique?
So there are a few. There's obviously the EU ADR. That's for the European Union for .eu domain names. So in that particular instance, you need to have a local presence in the European Union in order to keep it registered .eu domain. So you have to make sure that when you file the complaint that you actually qualify with the local requirements.
As the complainant, right?
As
Interesting.
the complainant, because the last thing you want to do is file this complaint and you've got the trademark rights and then they say, okay, but you don't qualify to hold it. So that's something that can be overlooked sometimes. That also is very similar to Australia, the AUDRP. Australia, to hold an Australian domain, you need a local presence, either a company, you need to be a citizen, have a matching trademark, or be part of the royal family because they qualify for that, funny enough.
Now, I'm sure that's the most common reason your clients qualify, right?
Yeah, exactly. I wish that was the case. And then Robert can attest to, we've done some Indian.in domain name recoveries, INDRP. And I think, Robert, I don't know if you want to expand more the logistics surrounding
Well,
that.
where there are practical things. Essentially, India, going back in time, it followed how the UDRP used to be. A complainant had to submit hard copies of the complaint and multiple hard copies. That then changed, certainly after UDRP many years ago. But the INDRP, or the Indian variant, was a little bit slower to change. And whilst technically speaking, it's now paperless, when you look at the minutiae of the requirements, a complainant still has to furnish hard copies of the complaint and evidence to the respondent. That increases costs. You might have courier costs. There's always a risk that papers could be lost, particularly if you're dealing with a country you're many miles away, et cetera, et cetera. There can be these little minutiae in the rules that you have to be aware of.
And that's I've seen in .in too, and tell me if you agree with this, but it seems a little bit less predictable. Like I've seen everything from a very generic dictionary word be ordered, transferred, to something that seems like it was more of this is probably cyber squatting, and it wasn't. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think in certain instances it depends, and I think this will relate to a conversation we can go into is the dispute resolution provider that you select to handle the dispute. I think going back to some CCTLDs, the issue there is that it's maybe underdeveloped in the sense that maybe there aren't a lot of complaints, so there's not enough case law on it. Maybe the panelists aren't really trained in it. There's some countries that we deal with that are quite complicated that have recently introduced a dispute resolution, and they're looking out to try and source panelists, because I do think it's important that you understand the local market, because if it's an IN domain, it's a national asset, so to speak, an online national asset. You have to understand the market and the laws within that country, obviously taking inferences from external and international rights and reputation. But I do think sometimes they do get it wrong. And I think this is where sometimes a dispute resolution may not be the right solution because of the risk involved. We all say you got one shot at it, because if you get it wrong, then you could lose it forever.
I guess there is always some of them. I know that .uk, for example, you can appeal, but there's always appealing to the courts in most cases, right?
It really depends. In some cases, it is quite difficult, because they would say the UDRP or whatever it is, whatever dispute resolution is a binding authority on the relevant people, and it's already been decided. And you can go around it, and they will draw inferences unless it was substantially wrong or they forgot to attach certain evidence. And that happens very often, where a clerk, a junior lawyer, will prepare something and not attach enough evidence, and it could be a technicality. So you do have the courts, and you can go through that process, but it does become a lot more difficult when you have this precedent hanging over your head, in my opinion.
Sure. And all of these are designed to, even though we talk about it can be too long, 60 days if you have a phishing domain, all of these are designed to hopefully be a lot faster than using the courts. That is the stated goal. But there's also, there's limited back and forth. Some of them allow you to respond to the other person. Some of them don't. And then there's also you can't quiz people, right? You can't you can't put them under oath and start asking them, tell me more about that. So it is limited.
And yes, and there are no damages as well when it comes to the UDRP. We have one particular instance where a client actually successfully defended a UDRP. We didn't do it, but they defended it. And this other trademark owner is taking them to the local courts in Europe. And that's probably going to go on for 2 to 3 years. So it is very time consuming and difficult. And then you have to educate the judges on what a domain name is, how it works. And I think that sometimes you get a lot of old school lawyers, no offense to fellow lawyers there, but they may not understand the technicalities of the internet. And I think that could cause some confusion with erratic decisions.
Yeah, I've definitely read some court decisions where I'm like, no, that's not right. The judge is incorrect here. So
exactly. And also I would like to mention, I think Robert as well, with the nominate, I think it's a 3-strike rule.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
I don't know, Robert, if you want to expand on it or...
Yes. If you have evidence that a domain owner has been involved in 3 prior UDRP complaints within a certain time period, you can ask that an inference of an abusive, that the panelists consider that this complaint should be abusive unless proves otherwise. That doesn't apply to the UDRP, for example, although it might be so. There's not necessarily that's written down in the rules, if you see what I mean.
So essentially with a DRS, that's a nominate DRS, that, if you have these 3 strikes against you, it's presumed that you're...
I wonder if does that work both ways? If someone files 3 losses, I wonder if that counts again. Because let's say there are some complainants that have been found, or in particular law firms that have filed more than 3 reverse domain name hijacking cases. So
I think also sometimes trademark owners and lawyers in particularly don't give the UDRP the respect that it deserves. They think it's more like an online form that you're filling out to get back a domain that's obviously yours. And they don't realize that you've got these 10 pages or a word limit with some evidence that you can attach. And you have to be concise, you have to be accurate, you have to really go into detail and rather overkill your complaint than provide insufficient information or evidence, because if it works against you, it can be terrible.
Yeah, I see a lot of cases where they phone it in on the first prong that you're basically showing you have a trademark, right, that matches or is very similar to the domain name, where it's just like, yeah, here's whether it be common law or otherwise, they just phone that part in and the panel says, yeah, this is probably cyber squatting, but I can't help you. You didn't fill this out correctly.
That's correct, exactly. So I think you have to guard against those things.
So let's talk about the different UDRP and other providers here. I think everyone listening is familiar with World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO. There's Forum, which I usually refer to as National Arbitration Forum. But talk to me about these and some of the differences between them and why someone might choose to use one rather than the other.
I think between Robert and myself, I think it's very important, and Robert can come in as well on this, is that it really depends on the particular matter, what you're trying to achieve. Some have strengths, some have weaknesses. For instance, there's the Czech Arbitration Court. Now, that is an option if you're price or cost sensitive, because they have a lower filing fee than the other two that you mentioned, WIPO and NAF. I think that's old school. They said they're called the Forum now. I think it's a rebrand. And so you may choose the Czech Arbitration Court. I think, Robert, you've noticed some instances that the main difference between a WIPO and the Forum on your side.
I have, yes, definitely. But just going back to the Czech Arbitration Court, their filing fee for 1 to 5 domains, I think it's €800. Whereas WIPO, on the other hand, is $1,500. The Forum, or formerly the National Arbitration, was $1,330. Now, thinking about that, it depends what you want the domain, what the decision to be. Maybe you want a fully reasoned decision with case law, maybe to use that as a precedent for future complaints. So maybe, if you think about it, the Czech Arbitration Court is not the right one, because if a panelist is only getting a much, much lower fee, maybe they might not produce such a well-reasoned decision that you might still get the right outcome, but the reasons behind it may
They're
not
going to spend as much time creating a precedent or that sort of thing. Yeah, okay.
Correct. But the other thing, just going back to, like you said in your opening comment, most brand owners, our people have heard of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and they certainly handle, for example, determined .cn domain complaints. But that, whilst it's so well known and so many brand owners use that can cause a huge backlog for them with cases queuing up before they're examined for admissibility, before the complaints are served on the respondents. That can add delay, and the brand owner might be desperate to get that domain name back. For example, for .cn domains, we really like using the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center, HKIAC. It's lesser well known, and I don't think they have that backlog of decisions. So when you file a complaint, they examine it for admissibility and it gets served on the respondent, in my experience, quicker than some of the more well-known forums.
But this also brings up a language question, in that when you file a case, if the registrant, if they're with, say, a Chinese registrar, everything's in Chinese, their terms of service, that sort of thing, don't you have to submit this in Chinese?
We actually have a high success rate in not filing it in Chinese. So even if it's through the Hong Kong arbitration dispute resolution providers, we argue that it should be heard in English. And there's a lot of evidence that we have to attach in support of that. And I think in most cases, what they may do is allow the respondent to respond in Chinese and for us to file the complaint in English. In some cases, the decision can be in Chinese in itself, but if it works in your favor, why not? Because there's obviously a cost associated with the translation. I know with the UDRP, it's whatever the registration agreement, whatever language it was in, is the language that you should file it in, while I think there is a discretion for some of them.
Right. In particular, does the respondent clearly understand the language? Maybe they created the website in English, so they clearly understand the language. Talk to me, are there any other differences that you say between WIPO and Forum?
I think this is a personal opinion. I think sometimes, and Robert, I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I think in WIPO, it can be sometimes a bit erratic with certain decisions, but some people would disagree with me. I just feel that NAF or Forum understands brand owners a lot better, and they realize the complexities that they're facing and the difficulties. So they tend to try and work towards resolving potential issues like that. And they can see through any, through charlatans trying to pretend that they have some sort of right to a domain. And like Robert says, is the responsiveness. I think we found that the Forum is a lot quicker. And the last thing you want to do is wait 1 to 2 weeks because you're waiting for them to go through the admin process. But then also with WIPO, you've got you can draw from panelists from different jurisdictions. Now, in some cases, that can be very good. In other cases, it could be very bad because you don't know if in that particular country the brand is known or it could have an adverse effect on you. While mostly, I think, Forum, stand to be corrected here, is mostly US-based. So I think there's more consistency there.
Robert,
I agree with that, Daniel. I would agree with that. Although I would say a lot of WIPO decisions have certainly shown more consistency in recent years, but certainly going back a few years, that I would definitely agree with that. But yes, we prefer the forum just for the reasons Daniel said.
Well, I mean, WIPO has taken some initiatives. They put together that guide, which even some of the forum panelists will refer to, right? Which is, hey, here's precedent, that sort of thing. Here's something for them to rely on.
Yes.
I think there are a lot of resources through WIPO, and I think that's part of the development and of intellectual property. There's a lot of policies and processes that come out of WIPO, and they serve a lot of good for the IP community. So I think from that side of things, I think they are leading with providing that information and even a resource of previous case law and having more flexibility in searching their database than the other providers.
Right. All right. This has been really fascinating, especially to get the perspective of a group that files often on behalf of complainants. So Daniel, Robert, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My guests this week have been Daniel Greenberg and Robert White of Lexsynergy. That's a wrap on this week's Domain Name Wire podcast. You can listen to all previous episodes at dnw.com/podcast or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening.